I want to start off today with a story that I think perfectly frames what we're going to talk about. A man and a woman are sitting in a restaurant, and she has an 8-penny nail protruding from her forehead. She looks at the husband and she complains about the awful headache that she has. Well, being a male, he immediately goes to the logical issue and he begins to talk about the 8-penny nail that has been driven into her skull. She keeps talking about her feelings. She keeps talking about her pain. Well, obviously, these two folks are not having the same conversation, which is where our story ends. Well, actually, it's where ours begins. Because we are living in a country where one side wants to talk about their feelings, the other side want to talk about facts. Now, depending on the conversation, the sides change. It could be confusing, so you need a program to keep track of the players. But in the immediate aftermath of the horrific massacres at the Nova Music Festival in Israel, October 7, 2023, in which 1,250 people were brutally murdered in the worst possible ways. Men, women, children, babies were beheaded. People were raped. Male and female were raped. The Jews of the world thought that at last Hamas had crossed a line that was so horrific, so inhumane, that the world would rally to them. They woke up on October 8th to discover that that was not true. Immediately after the attacks, there are spontaneous demonstrations at some of America's greatest universities. We now know those spontaneous demonstrations have been in planning for 18 to 24 months that condemned Israeli genocide of Palestinians and talked about the war crimes of the Israeli Defense Force. Well, there's only one problem with this scenario. The attacks didn't begin for another 14 days. Israel took a very moderate, thoughtful approach to responding to what happened. They became sure of the facts, and then they did what any state in the world would do when their boundaries are violated and when their citizens are murdered. They took action, which, by the way, is exactly what the United States did in the aftermath of September 11. But on the campuses of America, suddenly you heard chants like, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And a bizarre alliance occurred between radical Muslims calling for death to Israel and the genocide of Jews, along with radical Marxists. Now, I want you to think about how strange this is. There were signs on campuses like Columbia, Harvard, Penn, 50 other campuses that said, "Queers for Palestine." Sounds compassionate. Except in 2005, when Hamas took over in Gaza, they threw homosexuals off roofs. They threw people who could read off roofs. They threw people who disagreed with them off roofs. There's nothing liberal or humane about what Hamas does, which makes the alliance of Hamas, of radical Islam, and of radical Marxist an unholy alliance. Who could have ever imagined that the most radical purveyors of an ancient faith, who do what they do in the name of conserving the faith, would join hands with people who want to deconstruct the entire world? Except that's what happens in our world today. This is only one unholy alliance. They happen all the time. It's not about reason. It is about the nail in the head. And people who have no concept of what they're demonstrating for come out on behalf of the oppressed Palestinians. Dear friend of mine, Joe Green, was invited to speak at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, one doesn't really think of MIT as a hotbed of student radicalism, and yet there was an encampment that included MIT students as well as professional protesters who had no connection to MIT. They didn't just protest what they thought was wrong in Palestine, they harassed Jewish students. So Joe Green was asked to come to MIT and explain what he saw going on. Well, there are 700 Jewish students at MIT. Not one of them came to his lecture. You know why? Because they're afraid to leave their dorm rooms, because they have been cursed and threatened and beaten by their fellow students. Joe is one of the most kind and even-handed people I know. And he asked one of the students, he said, "Could you take me over to the encampment? I'd like to meet some of these students and help understand why they do what they do." And the student looked at him and said, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that. I don't think that'd be a safe place for me. He said, "Can you point me in the right direction?" So they pointed him in the right direction. And Joe is an open-hearted, gregarious guy. And he saw a knot of students, and he asked them why they were there. And they said, "Well, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." He said, "What does that mean to you?" He said, "Well, I don't really know." Now, here's what is interesting. That call recognizes that there are 7 million Jews living in Israel today. What exactly would you do with those 7 million Jews? Exterminate them? Oh, that's been tried. But that's the call. Shall they be forced out of their homes? From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. Well, not one student could tell Joe why they were there. In fact, most of them couldn't even tell him where Palestine was, and knew absolutely nothing of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They just had buzzwords. The nail was protruding from their heads. And no amount of conversation, no amount of logic could dissuade them from that position. The unholy alliance of radical Marxists and radical Muslims is one more indication of what's happening in this country, of how reasoned conversation, thoughtful approaches to solving complicated problems is just going by the wayside. That center ground, that middle ground, is eroding out from under our feet. You say, "Well, that doesn't have much to do with me because I don't live in Palestine and I'm not Jewish." Except we are creating a climate in this country where the most radical and even mutually exclusive positions can be brought together to undermine order, to undermine reason, to undermine human decency. If somebody says, "Well, that's the problem. I can't do much about it." Actually, we can. One thing we need to learn to do is to call out insanity when we see it, whether it is in our workplace or in a family or in a school board meeting. I think we have come to a place in this country where people who love this country and care about it, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or independents, but people who care about their communities are going to say, "You know what? This doesn't make any sense." When we deal with problems in this work team, when we deal with challenges in our community, we are going to carefully examine the facts of the situation. We're going to try to understand how we got here. And then we're going to talk about the possible solutions. As long as we are in this doom loop of insanity, driven by emotion, there's absolutely no hope for things improving. Barack Obama used to say, "You are the solution." President Obama was a great master of the English language. And whether I agree with him on everything or not, and I don't agree with half of what I say, so it shouldn't surprise anybody that I disagree with things a president would say. But he said, "Be the solution." And I think that's what it really comes down to for all of us, right? We just have to determine the kind of people that we're going to be. We have to make up our mind we're not going to be co-opted by snappy slogans, that we're not going to be carried away by the emotion of a situation. Now, this conversation today might cause somebody to say, well, is there any hope in the Middle East? There is. You realize that a couple of million Palestinians live within the borders of Israel? That most of them are Israeli citizens? That they have representatives in the Israeli Knesset? That some of them serve as law enforcement officers and school teachers? Some of them serve in the Israeli Defense Force? See, here is the pernicious and perverse nature of the dialogue right now. You would have the idea that every Israeli is a colonizer and that every Israeli soldier is a war criminal. When in fact, most Israeli Palestinians know that about the worst thing that could happen to any of them would be for Hamas to take over. They remember the scenes of people being thrown off roofs. They don't want that. Now, does that mean that everything is peaches and cream? No, of course not. We're talking about fallen humanity. And we all are. I am, you are, the Israelis are, the Palestinians are. Things happen. But if we believe in the rule of law, if we believe in certain core values to our societies, that gives us a way of moving forward. I'm going to suggest an alternative to the Unholy Alliance. To me, in some ways, the Israelis and the Palestinians are like conjoined twins. You know, sometimes you can separate twins shortly after birth, and they will both live. But very often, they may share a heart or they share other vital organs. And you can't separate them without killing them both. In a country where 80% of the people are Jewish and 20% are Palestinian, I'm going to suggest to you that they are in some ways like conjoined twins. Now, I don't have the right to impose any viewpoint on those people. I try to be the friend to both. I try to support the cause of peace and the cause of justice the best that I can. But in my soul, I know that with all their differences, if that is going to be a healthy, productive society over the long haul, those two groups of people just have to find a way to live together. It seems impossible to us. And yet, you know, for 400 or 500 years, the states of Europe were in a constant state of tension and distress. Frequent wars. It looked like England and France would be enemies forever. And yet, in the 20th century, after two bloody world wars, the first of which, World War I, killed 20 million, the second one killed 60 million, somehow the divided states of Europe recognized that they just had to find a way to get along, which it first of all gave us the European Common Market, then it gave us the EU. It's not perfect. French and English and German still disagree, and sometimes vociferously. I want to suggest to you that it's important to us that when we see an unholy alliance, wherever it is, we need to call it out, and we need to make up our minds that we are not going to be co-opted, that we will be compassionate and caring people to everybody, and not just chant the latest tagline of a smart PR guy, like "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." This is Dr. Gary Kellner. Thank you for joining us today on Fair Game. Hope to see you next time.